Is depression biochemical, spiritual, or volitional, meaning choices that we make? Yes. Will overcoming depression be biochemical, spiritual, or volitional? Yes. Welcome to the both and life. It is a both and. Either ors keep us in the pit. When I've shared my story of overcoming depression in a variety of different settings, and I've asked the question, how many of you personally, either currently or in the past, have struggled with depression or love someone who does? It's always at least 70% of those in attendance, sometimes as high as 90%. I've battled lifelong depression, and there's a significant genetic component to it. I believe both my mom and my grandmother died from undiagnosed depression. It wasn't that they committed suicide, it's just that at the end of their life, they stopped living until they didn't. All of my kids have struggled with depression and anxiety. So clearly, there's a genetic, a physical, biochemical component. In fact, when I was first diagnosed with depression, it was the time when I should have been the least depressed. I had been a pastor at that point for 8 years. I loved what I was doing. The church gave me a sabbatical, so I had 3 months off. We had 3 children. Life was great. It was at the end of that time off that I was officially diagnosed with depression in 1998. I've been on antidepressants ever since. But God has healed my depression. That's different from it being cured, and I'll explain that as we keep going. And healing is going to look differently for everybody, so I want to say that right up front too. But in this episode, I want to share my story. One, because it is a both and. And if we separate out the biochemical from the spiritual and from the volitional, then we stay stuck. I'm also sharing because we need to remove the stigma. Sadly, the stigma often is worse within Christian circles because there is a spiritual component to depression. But spiritual solutions alone often will not solve it because there's also a biochemical component. It needs to involve all three. And then finally, I'm sharing my story to shed some light on what it's like. If you've not struggled with depression, it can be hard to understand. I was sharing this story last summer, and there was a man who came up to me afterwards and said, immediately after you shared your story, and he had struggled with depression most of his life, his wife turned to him and said, "Is that what it's like?" And he said, "Yes." And then what he told me was that you may have saved my marriage because she just didn't understand. So again, I've struggled with depression most of my life. And I would describe depression with 3 different picture words. The first is a pit. In fact, in the book of Psalms, the word pit is used more than 20 different times. And most of the time, I think it's describing depression. When you're in a pit, there's not as much light. When you're in a deep pit, it can be slimy and it can be hard to get traction. You want to get out of the pit, but you can't gain any traction. You're just stuck there. It's also like a wet blanket that just is over the top of everything. And so things that you normally would enjoy, you enjoy less. And then the final picture is the word ants. You can think of the crawling kind, but it's an acronym for automatic negative thoughts. When you struggle with depression, you don't choose negative thoughts. They're automatic. In fact, we know now with brain chemistry and some of the science that there's neural pathways that are formed so that you just automatically react in a negative way. It can be irritability. It can be any number of different things. It can just be, well, I can't handle this. And so then that quickly can lead to some of the volitional struggles. So I experienced all of those. And I need to say that there are many people, probably some of you watching this, whose experience with depression, either personally or for someone that you love, has been far more serious, deeper in the pit than mine. I was never seriously suicidal. Certainly it crossed my mind, but I was never high on it's called the lethality scale. I was never highly at risk of suicide. And I remained mostly functional most of the time. I gave my best energy to ministry, which was its own problem. I've since gone on an apology tour with all of the kids. Because when I would get home from my ministry as a pastor, I often had very little left. And so my wife and my kids got scraps. I was more irritable with them. I wasn't as engaged with them. I wasn't as spiritually engaged with them. And I have lots of regrets over all of that. Most of that time, I knew that I should be doing things differently, which then added guilt. So then you have a spiritual component over the top of it too. Guilt and shame. And I'm sure I'll say this more than once, but nobody has ever gotten out of the pit of depression through guilt and shame. That will never work. And so there's a spiritual component from the enemy who's going to pile on with guilt and shame and make it go even deeper. But then there's also from the Lord who wants to help us get out of it, but we're not going to get out of it through guilt or shame. And the Lord never deals in shame. That's always coming from the enemy. Well, when you're struggling and you continue to struggle, then it's easy to see the volitional parts. Anybody who's ever been to a doctor for depression almost automatically has heard the doctor say, well, what are you doing for diet and exercise? Those are the two things that seem to help the most. Almost everybody in the medical profession agrees those two components will make a difference if you're struggling with depression. The problem, of course, is that what are the last two things that you want to pay any attention to if you're struggling with depression? Well, that would be diet and exercise. And so then more guilt, more shame, and the pit of depression goes deeper. So then when you're feeling really low and you just long to feel better, then not only are the things that you ought to be doing, but you aren't, those would be the sins of omission, omitting something that you ought to do. But then there's also the sins of commission. You do something to compensate. You just want to numb the pain. It's easy to see how you can get into all different kinds of addictions to just escape, to numb the pain. Some of the addictions can be bad in any measure, but others can be things that are normally okay. They're morally neutral. Sports would be an example. Video games would be an example. Those aren't inherently bad, but too much of them, when it becomes addictive, when it becomes a means of escape, then that's a problem. And so, guilty of all of the above, I struggled with all of those. Well, I'd been on a number of different medications for depression. In fact, there's a genetic test that you can take that will reveal which medications are most likely to help you and which might be most likely to make it worse. Because doctors do the best that they can, but brain chemistry is an area that we're still struggling to understand. When a doctor puts you on an antidepressant, they will almost always say, this might make it worse. And so if it does, you need to call us right away. So this DNA test identifies different antidepressants which go after different brain chemicals. And so you get green, yellow, and red. Green would be the most hopeful. Red would be probably want to stay away from those. And so I literally had tried every single one on the green list. Well, when the pandemic came around, that made things worse. I get energy from being around other people. And so now that's gone. I have some lung conditions that made me even more at risk. So I had to be even more careful during the pandemic and isolate for longer. Furthermore, it was shortly before that time that I had come to realize some additional childhood trauma that I was unaware of. So I was having to process through some of those childhood trauma and all the feelings related to that with a counselor while experiencing the isolation from others. And then further, I was dealing with unanswered prayer. Certainly depression would be one of those. My wife and I and many others that I love had prayed for me with my depression for decades, and nothing had happened. In fact, it was getting worse. When you pray for something and it gets worse, then you wonder what's wrong with your prayer life. And tell me if you've heard this before, but nobody has ever gotten out of the pit of depression through guilt and shame. So it all just snowballed and it got worse and worse. And toward the end of 2022, I told my wife, I'm done. Didn't mean suicide. It just meant I'm making peace with depression. I literally said, I know exactly the questions that the psychiatrist is going to ask. And I can get whatever med I want just by how I answered the questions. I've done it so many times, I just don't see that helping anymore. And I'm not going back to another one. And furthermore, if God wanted to heal me of depression, it's not like I haven't given him plenty of opportunities. My kids had noticed it too. And we'd been on a summer vacation, and the kids confronted my wife and said, "What's wrong with Dad?" Because I had just made peace with depression. This is apparently how I'm going to have to live out my life. I still gave my best energy to ministry. And so when I would come home, at this point we were empty nesters, my wife and I would often eat in silence, and then I would escape into my phone in the evening. So it was not a pretty picture. When I told my wife I'm done, she said, "You can't give up." I said, "Well, I did." "You can't give up." "Well, watch me." It was one of the worst evenings of our beautiful marriage, now over 36 years. Thankfully, my wife did not give up. So I mentioned at the beginning that depression is always going to involve a biochemical component, which can be exacerbated by childhood or adult trauma. We know now from brain sciences that trauma can affect our brain chemistry. So there's a biochemical component, there's a spiritual component, and there's a volitional component. Things that we ought to do but aren't, things that we ought not to do but we are. And all of them were in play. Well, because my wife did not give up, she kept praying, kept pleading. And because my ministry is a unity ministry, and so I know a lot of different people, we were able to ask some questions and find a different kind of doctor. Instead of a psychiatrist, my doctor was a PhD psychologist, which means he loves to talk. He loves to talk to you. You can't get out of there in less than an hour. But he was also a nurse practitioner with a specialty in mental health drugs, so he could prescribe meds. And so when we went, and I was not hopeful at all, when we went to see him, he gave me a little bit of hope, because he said, "Well, here's the first thing we're going to do. And if that doesn't help, then have you ever tried this?" And it was a new direction that we'd never tried before. "And if that doesn't help, then we're going to try this." So he gave me some options that had a glimmer of hope. And one of the things that I learned from him, which was maybe a little bit unique to my circumstance, he said, if you have medically resistant depression, which I did, And if you don't have ADHD, which I didn't, then the stimulants that are prescribed to help ADHD or ADD can have actually been shown to help with depression. And so I'd like to try one of those. So we tried some other things first, didn't help. So we tried a stimulant. And even from the very beginning, it helped a little bit. And then as we increased the dose, it helped a little bit more. And so that was encouraging. That was the first step in the right direction. For me, the biochemistry was the first piece that gave me hope to deal with some of the other parts. So the next piece for me, the next domino, was a spiritual one. I am often with other pastors or Christian leaders in a setting of prayer. We call them prayer summits. We had a 3-day prayer summit that we've been doing for years. And so part of that time is always a time where you meet with several other pastors and you're as transparent as you want to be. And you have an unlimited amount of time to just pray deeply. And so I shared some of my story. I shared more of my story than I had shared before, including the childhood trauma that I was working through and the depression that I was struggling with. And it's hard to admit that you're cynical about prayer when you've been a pastor for 34 years. And it's even harder to admit that you're cynical about prayer when now, instead of a congregational ministry, you're leading a ministry based on a prayer. That's hard to admit. But I shared that I've become cynical about prayer. If God wants to heal me, he's had plenty of opportunity. And I don't think he needs my prayers to do what he wants. So I'll pray because it's the right thing to do. But I have no confidence that it'll make any difference because he can do and he will do whatever he wants with or without my prayers. As I shared my story and my pain, there was a guy sitting right next to me by the name of Jack, and he started to weep. And the more I shared, the more he wept. And at the end of that time, he was shedding tears, and he just said, "I'm so sorry." And he embraced me. And that was the embrace of Christ. I look back on that moment and realize that the ice cap that had formed over my soul, so that I would pray about some things, and I still had some spiritual compartments that I liked to my life, but it wasn't coming anywhere near depression. That ice cap began to melt with that experience. So the spiritual piece was the second piece. The next hugely significant thing that happened was that my wife confronted me on one of my persistent sin issues. And because I already had a little bit of help, and because it was serious, and she made sure that I knew that it was serious, and she was absolutely correct. It's like, for the first time, I was able to say deeper than ever before, whatever it takes, I'm wrestling this thing to the ground. I'm not making peace with this any longer. And so I joined a 12-step group, and I'm still in that 12-step group today, and it's helpful. And so as you remove an area that produces guilt and shame, guess what? The enemy's got one less thing over your head. So that volitional choice to choose to repent, to choose to deal with a persistent sin issue, then also triggers the spiritual health. Because now the enemy can't throw guilt and shame over you and dig your pit of depression even deeper. So all these things are starting to snowball. There's a verse in Romans 12 that talks about the renewing of your mind. And because mental health is a mind issue, it's not only that, but that's part of it. The renewing of your mind is going to be part of the process of healing from depression. There were 2 different books in particular that were enormously helpful for me. The first is called A Praying Life by Paul Miller, and it has whole sections on cynicism. And so that helped my prayer life to become enlivened again. See, I had done spiritual devotions and spiritual disciplines all along the way. I never stopped doing that. I knew it was the right thing to do, but it wasn't helping. And I know the verses that say the joy of the Lord is your strength. And I know that because we have Jesus, we never can be without hope. I know that. But with depression, it just made the pit deeper. But now I'm starting to understand some additional aspects to prayer and what you do when you pray and it doesn't get answered. In fact, sometimes it gets worse. What are some spiritually helpful things, even in the scriptures, that we can do to get through that darkness of the soul? And so that was significantly helpful. The second book was one that my wife and I worked through together. It's called Living Fearless by Jamie Winship. And so both of us worked through that book and did the different exercises that are in it. And one of those helps you to recognize some of the lies that you have believed from the enemy, and then helps you to come into your true identity in Jesus. And that was hugely significant. Several of those lies, they're automatic negative thoughts. Several of them just dropped off instantaneously when I went through that exercise. And so now my mind is being renewed, which then also means that my marriage is being renewed. And so then it gives me courage to do hard things and to tackle crucial conversations that I would have avoided in the past. And so there's healing that's taking place over any number of different areas. And so momentum continues to grow. And so my prayer life gets richer and deeper. And there's transformation that's taking place day after day. Compartments of my life that had been spiritually alive are now coming down so that it touches all of life. And it's a both and. It's spiritual and it's physical. And so it affects some of those things like diet and exercise that have been harder to deal with. And so it's touching everything, and that continues right to this day. So when I say that I've been healed from depression but not cured, what do I mean? Well, I've also struggled with asthma since I was an infant. And I would say that I've been healed from asthma, and medication has been the primary part of that. So I still take medication for asthma, and that medication has healed it. I don't have asthma anymore as long as I'm on my meds. If I were to stop taking them, it would probably get worse. But with the meds, I'm able to do anything anybody else can. I can play racquetball, I do, and so asthma does not negatively impact my life. So I'm still on some antidepressants. I'm still on a much lower dose of both antidepressant and that stimulant. But depression is not negatively affecting my life. I still have depressive feelings. In fact, I've been going through one of the tougher seasons for a while. But God brings me out of the pit every single time. And because I know it's biochemical, spiritual, and volitional, I'm engaging all three of them as I continue to grow toward greater and greater healing. And so difficult things don't scare me. I know that God has healed depression. He's not going to allow the enemy to dump me back into that pit of depression to where I can't get out. Well, if you've watched this far, I want to summarize with a few practical steps that all of us can take, whether we are the one battling depression ourselves or whether it's somebody that we love. And I really believe that it's harder to watch someone you love struggling with depression than it is to go through it yourself. What I put my wife through for all those years of our marriage, just breaks my heart because it was so hard to watch me struggle. And then, of course, the sin issues that compound that and the poor choices that compound it. It's a nasty disease. But here's the first thing that I would want to say to you. whether it's about your depression or somebody that you love. Never give up hope. If you find that hard yourself, then get some people around you who will not give up hope, who will pray for you, who will have hope for you. Get some other people who can have that encouragement that you can't find any longer, but never give up hope. God is not stumped by mental illness. It doesn't have him stumped. He's not panicking over, gosh, I can heal all kinds of things, but I have no idea what to do with mental health. That's not where the Lord is at. Never give up hope. There is a good God in heaven who loves us, and he will help us. Healing may not look the same for everybody, but he will help us get to a place where we can live life outside of the pit of depression. The next thing I would say, just in summary, is attack it on all three fronts. I know a lot of us have been conditioned to believe that maybe there's something wrong with us if we're taking meds, and especially for depression, because we've gone to pastors and we've gone to churches, and maybe we've gone to places that have even told us that. And I want to say, no, it's the physical and the spiritual. It's the physical, the mental, the spiritual, all of those go together. Don't accept guilt or shame for taking an antidepressant any more than you would for taking insulin. Our bodies, including our mind, are whole, and God made them. If he's given scientists and the medical depression insight, then let's take advantage of that. If we only go to a doctor, they may not deal with the spiritual part. If we only go to a spiritual resource, they may not deal with the medical part. If we go to a behaviorist, a therapist who's going to work on our behaviors, they may not deal with the other two parts. It's going to take all three of them, so attack it on all three fronts. I don't know that it matters which one you start with, but you're probably going to have to get to all three before you'll experience healing. Because if depression involves all three, then healing is going to involve all three. Especially if you're in Tucson, but not limited to Tucson. There's a ministry called Bless This Brain. Every time in Tucson that I talk about this issue, I bring my friends Jared and Trish with me because they have both struggled with mental illness, and their whole ministry, blessthisbrain.com, is based on helping people, coming alongside people who are struggling with mental health issues, themselves or someone they love. They can help, and they know what it's like. That's not my area of expertise. My story is the main way that I can help. But they have resources. They have cohorts of people. They have a cohort online. So if you're not in the Tucson area, I encourage you, check it out, and maybe consider joining their next online cohort. Get some help. Don't do it alone. The next suggestion would be to be honest and be transparent. When I was finally honest with my friends, my pastor friends, about what I was struggling with, that helped some healing to begin. Be honest with God. Part of what Jamie Winship talks about is don't dress your prayers up. Tell him, I'm afraid, I'm struggling, I'm afraid I'm going to go back into the pit of depression. I'm way more honest in my prayers. My prayers look more like the book of Psalms than probably they ever have before. Be honest with yourself, be honest with God, be honest with others. Next, rely on others to help you discover your blind spots. That's especially true with the ants, the automatic negative thoughts. They're automatic. You're not going to see them yourself. So get some people around you. Invite them to speak into your life. Invite them to compassionately say, hey, is that true, or is that an automatic negative thought? Get some people to help you reveal your blind spots, because you don't know what you don't know. Two more. Even after healing, those old depressive neuropathways remain, and they're going to have to be retrained. It's actually an aspect of discipleship. to break the lies that tend to accumulate in our lives, to break the old habits, the ways that we'd handled stress that aren't helpful anymore, our coping mechanisms from childhood trauma that got us through, but they're not helping us now. We're going to have to keep on the process of retraining, growing, discipling. And it's okay to have a process. Guilt and shame will never get anybody out of the pit of depression. So we keep on because there is a God who loves us and he will carry us all the way through to the end. There's a beautiful verse that says that what God has begun, he will bring to completion. And so trust that. And then the last is just, I'll use the imagery from Paul Miller's book. The best stories are the ones that are filled with tension, where you don't know what's going to happen when you're reading a fiction book and you can't put the pages down. It's because the tension is almost killing you and you're just reading the book. You have to know what's going to happen. Well, it's not so fun when you're living in that tension. But here's what I want you to trust. There is a God who knows the story. I shared this on a previous episode, but I'm sharing it here too. He knows your story, and the cross and the empty tomb prove beyond any doubt that he loves you. He loves each of you. He loves all of us. He hasn't forgotten you just because you struggle with a mental health issue. So trust that. Go to him. Get some other people around you. It's not fun when you're in the middle of the tension in the story, but there is a conclusion to the story because God is the best story writer that there ever was. Overcoming depression is a both and. It's not either biochemical or spiritual or choices that we make, volitional. It's all of them. And healing involves all of them too. And never give up hope. Thank you so much for watching. When I share this story, I've often had people come and say, I believe you saved some lives today. And so you know some people who need to see this. I encourage you, find a way to share it with them. If you've got some comments, put them in the thread. Subscribe to the channel. Like the episode. Help it get out to more people because more people need to hear testimonies of overcoming depression. We have all kinds of testimonies, but we don't hear that one as often. Well, we need to. Let's break the stigma and let's allow God to do his work in helping us to overcome depression. In the next episode, we're going to deal with what I find to be the single hardest thing when trying to answer Jesus' prayer that as his followers, we would be one. And that is the question, should we be passionate about unity or passionate about truth? And the answer is yes in the both and life.